Good afternoon. I am Barbara Flaherty, the Executive Vice President of the Irish National Caucus, which is the Irish lobby on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. With me is Father Sean McManus, President and founder of the Irish National Caucus. Today's discussion, which centers on the Kincora Richard Kerr case, is going to be moderated by DONAL LAVERY. Okay, now over to you, Donald. We can't hear you.
Basically, what I would say to people as a sort of brief summary, is the volume better now?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Is that Kincora itself was initially, it was a welfare home for children, which operated in the post-war period up until 1980s/81. And essentially it was ran by 3 paedophile care staff. The scandal itself was broken by the media in Southern Ireland, not in Northern Ireland. And the narrative has always been that the abuse that was going on was confined to the children's home. However, we know of one particular victim and survivor, Richard Kerr, whose story tells quite a different picture and confirms essentially that the official narrative is wrong and incorrect, including that of the latest inquiry. So with us, we have Father Sean McManus of the INC, and also we have Captain Colin Wallace, who he himself was the primary whistleblower within the British Army relating to the scandal itself. He subsequently was framed on charges of manslaughter, which were found to be bogus, and acquitted. But basically, we are making this, the purpose of the presentation is to inform people as to not simply, what has happened, because you could rehearse that, for weeks, but really what we're seeking to do to actually try and get some redress for Richard Kerr, who himself is now a US citizen. And on that note, what I would say is that I'll move to basically the first question. We've drawn up a list of what we think people would be interested to hear in terms of this particular ordeal. And I'm going to put each of them to Father Sean and also to Colin. But we were meant to have a third participant, a journalist from who writes for the Belfast Telegraph, Catherine Johnson, but unfortunately, due to extenuating circumstances, she's not able to make it today. So, Colin, over to you. One of the things I would ask you is that, out of everyone here today, you grew close to the murdered journalist Lyra McKee, who published a book about Richard Kerr and his experiences regarding Kincora before her death. She was also working on, as I understand it, a documentary and another book called The Lost Boys, which was about children who were disappeared during the conflict and we presume to be murdered by agents of the state connected to Kincora. Basically, what I would ask you is that she has made reference to the use of state agents who were recruited by being sexually compromised. Can you tell us just a bit about that particular malpractice by British intelligence?
Well, I think in terms of all intelligence agencies throughout the world, one of the key things is looking for vulnerabilities. And the idea, if you can then get control over that individual because of the vulnerabilities, you can almost make them do anything. And it was particularly important in Ireland because there were very strong religious beliefs, both on the Protestant side and on the Catholic side. And the whole idea of child abuse was literally something that the community struggled with. I think people knew that it was going on. But you see, Ireland was very conservative with a small c, and therefore during that period, talking about sexual matters was just not done. And if it was usually in a joke sense. But if you can imagine in Belfast, where you had in the 70s, a huge amount of political violence going on, part of the problem there was that the intelligence services were trying to amass as many sources of information as possible. So any hook that could be gained to get people to provide information, of course, was huge. Now, I'm not saying whether that's good or bad. I'm saying that was the reality of that period. And clearly, if someone like one of the particular members of the Kincora home where Richard Kerr was regarded as a pillar of the loyalist community. You know, he was an evangelical preacher. He preached sexual purity. The idea that if that man suddenly was identified as a child abuser, the damage would be huge, not just to him, but to the organizations that he belonged to. He was a key figure, for example, in the Orange Order. So though,
and also the Ulster Unionist Party.
Oh, did, absolutely.
Yeah.
So although I'm not quite sure of the particular instances that Lara is talking about here, although she and I had many discussions, the principle is exactly the same.
Yeah, you see, really, I remember reading that you could sum it up in terms of a lot of these figures who are sexually compromised and as a result are blackmailed into becoming agents, that it's rather like trying to keep a tiger by the tail. Or certainly in the instance of, let's say, William McGrath, it's rather like sending a rabbit to fetch a lettuce, in that undoubtedly he had originally worked for MI6, as we understand it, and then had been sort of passed over to MI5 when the conflict kicked off. There was an important point that I would mention that Chris Moore highlighted in his Spotlight documentary, which was that the organization which McGrath was the leader of, Tara, basically, Chris highlighted that it wasn't simply that Tara was an organization which, you know, engaged in evangelical and loyalist events, but rather it was home to some people who would go on to become leaders of unionism and loyalism in the future. There were certainly people that had close associations with Tara, like, for example, now deceased Lord James Molyneux of the Ulster Unionist Party, the Reverend Robert Bradford, who was subsequently murdered. Chris has also highlighted that there were people, Roy Garland, another member of the Ulster Unionist Party, who, like yourself, tried to blow the whistle on the scandal.
Donald, excuse me, we're at the almost 11:10 point, okay. So I wanted to keep us on track.
Okay, yep. Now, the second question that I would just put to Colin is that after the victims themselves, I mean, arguably, you suffered the most in terms of a malicious prosecution for trying to expose this horrendous ordeal against children, whilst a captain in British Army intelligence and an official of the British Army. And can I ask why you refused to cooperate with the latest British government historical institutional abuse inquiry on Kincora that was led by Judge Hart?
Well, I think that, first of all, there were 4 inquiries. The first one was fairly short-lived, and in fact, that inquiry resigned. The members resigned at lunchtime the first day because the police were still carrying out investigations. So there was a great deal of disquiet within the community about the way it was being handled. And so the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland then created an inquiry where the RUC brought in a chief constable from a police organization in the United Kingdom to oversee the investigation, and that was Sir George Terry. Now, although at that stage, George Terry was supposed to be an impartial police officer, we now know from documents he was the preferred choice of John Herman, the chief constable of the RUC. So at that stage, you know, certain things appeared to be wrong. And then once the Terry inquiry reported, what was realized was that it misled Parliament because, first of all, Sir George Terry's officers were not allowed to interview MI5 members. And of course, James Pryor was assuring Parliament everything would be open. Now, the key thing at this stage,
as was Mrs. Thatcher, I think, as well.
Absolutely. But at that stage, what then happened was that we found documents that have been now officially released. And at the Northern Ireland office, there were senior intelligence figures who didn't want the Secretary of State to have a judicial inquiry, because that would bring into the open the links between MI5 and some of the key people. Now, that's not my view. That is now available in the public domain. That's quite interesting, you see, because what happened was the British Parliament didn't know that this was happening. They just believed these inquiries were all producing results. So in fact, the Terry inquiry failed. And then immediately after that, as the MI5 wanted, a judicial inquiry was set up, led by Judge Hughes. Now, Judge Hughes did a terrific job, but his terms of reference were deliberately altered to exclude specifically the police and army intelligence. And all he was able to investigate was the administration of homes like Kincora. So the whole idea of cover up and all the rest of it wasn't within his remit. Therefore, his report was meaningless. So at that stage, we go forward to the HIA inquiry. Now, contrary to what's been said, I volunteered to take part in the HIA inquiry. My solicitors wrote to the inquiry, they acknowledged that. But then what was interesting was that Sir Anthony Hart, who was the chairman, he told the press that he believed that he and his inquiry did not have sufficient powers to investigate MI5.
Yes.
And it was at that point that my solicitors and I thought, this is going to be more of the same. It is absolutely pointless taking part. And I opted out. And so did other people as well, by the way. Captain Brian Gemmell did and Roy Garland did. And I think now the more we look at the Hart inquiry, we realize just what a very, very difficult or an inquiry lacking credibility. Key witnesses weren't interviewed. You know, people who were actually offering information weren't being interviewed.
Colin, one of the points I would make, I mean, just to clarify it so that no one can say that the inquiry did not know, because you can actually check online the link to the website of that inquiry, that the Chris Moore book on the scandal, which detailed the issues regarding British intelligence, that was admitted as evidence. And indeed, a former DUP assemblyman, Clifford Smith, he himself actually provided, he is named in that book, and I think he may have written the prologue of it, but he also detailed for the inquiry how he had been abused by McGrath as part of a conversion therapy. So, I mean, I should make the point that it's not simply yourself as a whistleblower and Father Sean as well as me saying these things. You know, other people from a wider variety of backgrounds have actually put their neck on the line to come forward. And
Yes, and I think you say there was an individual called Hugh Mooney. He was the information advisor to the general in charge of all Operation Northern Ireland. He was a senior Foreign Office figure, and actually he told the Sunday Correspondent newspaper quite clearly that I had told him about the abuses at Kincora. Now, he left Northern Ireland in December 1973. So in other words, I had to tell him about those abuses before that. He was never interviewed by the police. He was never called to give evidence to the HI inquiry. So, you know, any inquiry is designed to be meaningful. I took part, for example, with the Savile inquiry and also with Richard, completely different. And the way it was handled just made everybody, I think, feel very, very uneasy.
Well, an obvious example as to the distinction between the inquiry you just mentioned, which for anyone who doesn't know was the inquiry into the events of Bloody Sunday and the murder of civilians, is that inquiry was able to use the journalist Martin Dillon's research to compel the British Prime Minister Sir Edward Heath before it and have him cross-examined. Whereas, for example, people in relation to Kincora, those who were ministers in the Thatcher government, for example, who would have him, or officials from the Ministry of Defence and the Home Office, they couldn't be compelled, even if Judge Hart had wanted to do that.
Well, absolutely. And that was one of the reasons why my solicitor advised me not to take part, because you see, there was a parallel inquiry going on to child abuse in London at that stage. And it had entirely different powers. It was able to compel people, whereas the Hart inquiry couldn't call, for example, service witnesses who were now living in England, or indeed documents. And so, although the government released some documents, the HI inquiry, what is significant is the documents they didn't release. And that again says to me that couldn't have happened by accident. It had to happen by design. And of course, nobody has challenged that. The interesting thing is that the HI inquiry has been accepted almost as the definitive version. It's not.
The impression that gives essentially is that you basically, the note that it strikes is that who cares if Irish children were sacrificed to paedophiles working for British intelligence? You know, you don't matter, you're second-class citizens, and we don't want you. That's how, you know, in terms of some of the victims have stated that to me, in that they've felt that compared to those in England who were able to compel and bring forward documentation and witnesses, they felt that there was a discrimination of treatment by the British government. And
I think that's right, because you see, the inquiry in England, the victims are allowed to have their own lawyers cross-examining witnesses. Yes. There was no cross-examination of witnesses on the HI inquiry.
Excuse me, Donal. To stay on time track, we're going to have to move to our next participant.
Okay, I'll ask Father Sean, and then we'll come back to Colin. So Father Sean, just in terms of the questions that we have for yourself, right. Meanwhile, after what Colin has said, the recent new international development by way of the Richard Kerr case is the Irish National Caucus in Washington has raised the issue in the United States Congress. And for that, we now turn to Father McManus, who will tell us what the Irish National Caucus has been doing so far in relation to Richard Kerr.
Thank you. Well, LAVERY deserves full credit for getting the Irish National Caucus raising the Richard Kerr case in Congress. Without him, it would not have happened. In May 2021, he called me and asked me in a cleverly formed question, can the Irish National Caucus do for the Protestant Richard Kerr what you have done for the Protestant Raymond McCord? In other words, raise the issue in the Congress. And of course we agreed, and I called Richard in Texas to get his formal permission, and he was delighted and gave his consent. Now, May 2021 was a very difficult time to raise any issue really in the US Congress, because it was just 4 months after the storming of the US Capitol, a few minutes from here, by white racists who were violently rebelling against their own government, because those racists oppose democracy, equality, fair play, and solidarity and equality for all. For me, it was sadly, maybe dramatically, a bit reminiscent of the Orange insurrection that led to the creation of the 6-county state of Northern Ireland, voted unilaterally by the London Parliament with the assent of the King of England on December 23rd, 1920. To me, that was a very sad remembrance. However, despite all the difficulties, we did manage to raise the issue fairly effectively in the US Congress, with more to come. We put out our first press release on May 19th. We wrote to over 350 members of Congress physical letters, And we wrote to the congressional friends, longtime congressional friends of the Irish National Caucus, and to all the congressional members of the Human Trafficking Caucus, which is very relevant to this issue. And that is chaired by Congresswoman Maloney, who also chairs the House Oversight Committee, which is regarded as one of the two most powerful congressional committees in the Congress, period.
Yes, that they have scrutiny over the intelligence services in the US, as I understand it.
And then we also wrote to Richie Neal, who's not only the chairman of the Friends of Ireland, but the Ways and Means, considered also equally powerful in the Congress, not on the Irish issue per se, but it gives you the quality and the standard of how this has been raised with very important people. The other person that will be familiar to at least maybe people in Ireland is a wonderful congressman, Brendan Boyle, whose father, as I tell the congressman, his father is from the second best county in Ireland, namely Donegal. Humility forbids me mentioning the best of all. Now, the other committee that was very important in this context is the Congressional Tom Lantis Human Rights Commission, and it's co-chaired by Congressman Jim McGovern, a longtime friend and congressional friend of the Irish National Caucus, and by Chris Smith. When the Republicans were in power, Chris Smith, God bless him, was the chairman of several committees, subcommittees. And Chris has held in the past 20 or so years, I think it's 17 congressional hearings on Northern Ireland, a world record regarding Northern Ireland. We also briefed the office of Congressman Bill Keating from Massachusetts, who has a special interest in Ireland. And we contacted Congressman Allred in Texas, who now is Richard's congressman. And I should add here that we've disseminated as strongly as possible a famous documentary called The Man Who Knew Too Much, featuring John Wayne. Oh no, not John Wayne.
I think he'd consider that a compliment.
Yeah. I can see how you make that mistake.
Views, Colin. Congratulations. Here's something in particular we did with professional legal expertise from Ireland. We had a special briefing paper titled "The Kincora Kerr Case, the British Northern Ireland Vice Ring," by a person who does not represent legally Richard, but he's an expert in the law, North and South. And this is quite a powerful presentation. And of course, I have to also here acknowledge the huge help we have gotten from Colin there himself. There's a particular expertise in all of this. I'm conscious of the time, so Barbara, does... Are we okay?
I'll ask your second question, yeah?
Yeah, go ahead.
So apart from all the obvious reasons, what in particular drew you to both, in terms of the McCord and Richard Kerr case?
Well, I guess justice makes me tick. And in this particular context, I believe ecumenism and reconciliation are at their very best and truest when Protestants and Catholics not only pray for peace, but also work together for justice, because peace is the fruit of justice, as Pope John Paul II memorably said. That means an awful lot to me. That, you know, it's easy to pray for peace, and we ought to, of course, pray for peace. But I think the key to all of this is when people work for justice, because that's the great equalizer. prescinding from ideology and nationalism or republicanism or unionism or Toryism or whatever you want. If one focuses on justice, I think that's the key. Also, Donal, I should say that granting my background in Fermanagh, I very conscious, super conscious, I guess, that when Protestants and Unionists and Loyalists dare break rank and challenge British intelligence and challenges the British government, they are immediately isolated and shunned by the Protestant power structure and establishment. It happens instantaneously. And that gives one more sympathy for people who have done that, because they do, certainly in America, need solidarity and support. So apart from the intrinsic merit of those two cases, one has to, in America, be very anxious to show support in these cases. So for example, Raymond McCord Sr. to this day keeps in amazement, but not really in surprise, he keeps saying to me, Sean, in all these years, not one Protestant Unionist politician or clergyman has come up to me and said, Raymond, sorry for your troubles. Not one. He's shunned because they're all scared of seen to be taken on the not so much the government, the intelligence apparatus. And that's why I have a particular extra admiration here for Colin, because he's, boy, has he taken on the establishment in the very center of the beast, so to speak. So this demands solidarity. Any Irish person worth his salt or her salt in America should be supporting all these cases.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I have admired about Colin is that essentially when he first came forward with these disclosures, he was regarded as, he was portrayed as something of a Walter Mitty type. There were newspapers, British tabloids who tried to portray him as psychiatrically unwell, as dishonest and so forth, and as though he was making all of this up. When, I mean, the victims themselves have verified essentially that the allegations that Colin had been making at the time about what was taking place, not just in this home, but the wider ring, was in effect the truth. There's one thing that I'd point out, and it really struck me in that I found it an enormous injustice, was that one of the victims who has since died and who Richard knew, his name was Clint Massey. Colin is aware of him. Now this man had lived in Kincora as a boy. He had been raped, including by William McGrath, and he in his statement to the inquiry in 2017, he stated that the plea bargains which were given to the three paedophile staff who had been raping children in Kincora and trafficking them, he stated that one of them got a very small number of years, and that this victim had basically taken out a loan to purchase a record player at the time, which, you know, back then they were more expensive than equivalent music technology would be today. But he said to himself, and he put it in the statement, you know, that man is going to walk free before I've paid off the loan for my own record player, in terms of the time frame for repayment. I mean, that struck me as particularly inequitable, and also the fact that that particular victim, he happened to die in the hospice without a penny in compensation from the British state, because Stormont had collapsed here following the renewable heat incentive scandal.
Excuse me, Donal, we need to move to Father McManus's last question.
Yep. So, see, in relation to the McCord and Richard Kerr case, sorry, how would you view the McCord and Kerr case compared with, for example, that of the murdered solicitor Patrick Finucane?
Well, I think the Irish National Caucus, in fact, I know, was the first to brief members of Congress on the Pat Finucane case. And of course, that case is huge support in the Congress. But one of the things I've come to see very clearly over the past many years of raising individual cases in the Congress, doing that for over 50 years actually, is that I think the McCord and the Kerr case are two cases that the British government fear in particular. You see, England can more easily deal with having oppressed and colluded with the killing of Catholics in Ireland. Hey, they've had a lot of practice in that. They're masters of that. They have been doing it since 1169. 850 years of diplomatic practice in dealing with covering up that issue. And of course, they've gotten away with it. And their typical resort was quietly whispering, well, you know, it was very difficult, very hard to distinguish the IRA from the local population. And so many of them were supporting the IRA, and yet swift and strong action was needed, blah, blah, blah. The fog of war and all of that old stuff. But when the British government is confronted in the US Congress with the fact they also killed and mistreated Protestants, they become like a deer caught in the headlights. They can't handle it. That has struck me powerfully, forcefully over the years.
And just say on that point, Father Sean, just a quick intervention on that point. What I would say is where there is a particular stake in this for US policymakers is that one of the abusers that was linked to Kincora and who had actually raped Richard Kerr was his child psychiatrist, Dr. Morris Fraser, who has been named by, for example, Chris Moore and others. Fraser went on to rape children as part of a paedophile ring in Rhode Island and was indicted for that in the US. But sorry for interrupting, but I just thought I'd point that out.
That's okay. I try to avoid mentioning names in these presentations. But the question you see, this issue raised in the Congress is, how is the killing and abusing of Protestants necessary for national security? How is using the boy, Richard Kerr, from age 8 to 18 as a sex slave by powerful men who trafficked him all over Ireland, Britain, Europe, and finally to America? How is that preserving the Union and protecting British national security? Or for that matter, how is the mistreatment of Colin? How is that advancing British interests and national security? He was a soldier, he was a policeman doing his duty, and yet he was treated this way. How can the British Embassy, with a straight face, defend that in the US Congress? How was the colluding and murder of young Raymond Orr, who had proudly worn the uniform of the Royal Air Force?
Indeed.
How is that protecting national security? It's impossible. It's impossible for them to defend the record here. And that's one more reason why these cases are so important today in the Congress, plus the fact that Richard, of course, is an American citizen.
Excuse me, Father Sean, we need to move on to the next section that Donald will take care of.
Yes, just on that point, I'll just ask Colin just a quick question. In that, following the excellent documentary about yourself, Colin, which premiered during the pandemic, "The Man Who Knew Too Much," which Father Sean has referenced, you've actually launched legal proceedings against the British state for deceit and misfeasance in public office, if I'm right. Can you just tell us a bit about these and why you felt the need to do so after the flawed Hart inquiry?
Well, first of all, I think in terms of my role in Northern Ireland, I had two job descriptions. One was fake, that could be used with people in general. And the other one, of course, was psychological operations, which was very, very sensitive. In 1973, I was given by Army Intelligence a document about William McGrath and about Kincora and about various issues about his sexual proclivities. And that document was marked very clearly for the press. So the Army wanted me to get the press to have a look at what was going on in Kincora. That's now been confirmed. But a senior MI5 officer who was based at Lisburn as well, and who stopped one of my colleagues, Brian Gemmell, from investigating Kincora, he reported me to MI5 headquarters in London for a breach of security. So here you had two opposing forces, literally yards from each other, doing two totally different things. In 1975, I was disciplined by the MOD under my false job description, not my true job description, and I was forced to resign. Years later, when the MOD looked at my role, particularly the Permanent Undersecretary, they decided that I had been badly treated, and they carried out a new investigation. So in terms of what was actually known at that time, you have to consider that within the Ministry of Defence and the intelligence services, there were different people who had different objectives. And so that makes it very confusing for people on the outside. Why really was I doing two things? To some people, I was doing the correct job, and to other people, I was working against them. And because I'm caught in the middle, I couldn't actually do anything about my case. Now, the Metropolitan Police looked at the way the MOD handled my disciplinary hearing, and they decided that potentially that was fraud.
Yes.
But the DPP, directing legal cases, told the police they should not investigate the case. Now, that's shocking, where you get the law officer of the Crown telling the police not to investigate, not to charge, not even to investigate. So the only thing that I have left now to do at my age is to take it to the court. I have absolutely no way to go forward.
On that point, one of the things I would say, which I've always admired about the US, is that, and it shows the benefit of increased democracy, is that people can actually elect an attorney general in terms of at a state level. They have some sway as to who holds that office and how they exercise its functions. Whereas we know for example, in the UK and Ireland, those offices are political appointees usually. And naturally, they generally seek to toe the line of the government of the day. But sorry for interrupting.
No, just a corollary to that, the DPP person who stopped the police from investigating my case, ironically, a few years later was arrested by the police in a red light district with prostitutes, and he was forced to resign. So it's interesting, you see that in that world, nothing is the wilderness of mirrors, which James Angleton of the CIA said, that nothing is exactly how it is. And people just walk in their own boxes. They're too frightened to get out or say anything because they may get the black spot, which then makes them unreliable. They lose their security rating and the right of a job. And after I left the MOD, for years I couldn't get a job. I did get a job with BAA at the airport. They took my security rating away and I was made redundant. And so I had to eventually spend the rest of my life working for myself. So you become an outcast, and when people know that happens, everyone's frightened to do anything, and they're frightened to do the right things. That's the key. And so we end up really in this vicious circle, and nobody wants to know. Just finally, on this point, I wrote this year to the members of the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee of Parliament personally, and I sent them a collection of documents corroborating everything I've just said to you. Not one person acknowledged my letter. Not one. Northern Ireland Affairs Committee. That, I think, is a disgraceful picture of our democracy.
You also wrote to, if I remember, Theresa May, who had been the Home Secretary and subsequently the British Prime Minister, who had set up the latest historical inquiry into Kincora and some of the other homes.
Well, Theresa May, you see, promised Parliament that she would leave no stone unturned as far as the HIA inquiry was concerned about MI5. And she wrote to various politicians about that. Well, you see, we now know that actually MI5 refused to allow their officers to be questioned by the police. Theresa May's promise went out the window, but nobody again has done anything about that. And again, you have two systems. You have political statements up there, but the reality on the ground is entirely different.
Yes, I mean, one example that comes to mind by way of distinction is that in the US, I remember there was I think it was a director of the CIA, his name, Dick Helms was his name. He was actually jailed for misleading Congress, if I recall correctly. Whereas I think all of us would agree that there's just no way that would happen in the British Parliament by a director of MI5 or MI6.
Oh, no, because, for example, Ian Cameron, who reported me for bringing the attention of the press to Kincora, when Sir George Terry's officers wanted to interview him, they were told they weren't allowed to. And Ian Cameron was never questioned by the police in connection with Kincora. And yet withal, he stopped the army from investigating him.
So would it be fair to say, I mean, I put this to Father McManus and then to yourself, Colin, would it be fair to say that both of you see parallels in this case of Kincora and Richard Kerr with, let's say, the Patrick Finucane murder or that of Rosemary Nelson? And what I mean by that is that the business of collusion and the running of agents actually extends to number 10 Downing Street and Whitehall, in the sense that these people are supposed to hold them to account, or at least be responsible for them. I'm not sure they are, but do you see, I'm asking really about the relationship between, for example, the Kerr case and those in Downing Street, in that would it be fair to say that Father McManus and yourself both find it very difficult to believe that those sitting there, both past and present, would not be aware of the extent to which these horrific crimes against children were going on?
Well, I'll give you a good example of that. 1989, there was an internal inquiry in the MOD about my role in Northern Ireland, and the Permanent Under-Secretary discovered that Parliament had been misled by government ministers. And he produced a report, and that report went to the Defence Secretary, Tom King. And Tom King wrote to Margaret Thatcher personally, and they said, the report is too sensitive to give to Parliament. But what we will do is we'll create another inquiry under Sir David Calcott QC.
Yes.
But we will limit what he can look at. And in that memo, which I have a copy of, it says, we have to keep him away from Kincora, Clockwork Orange, and assassinations.
Just for anyone watching, Clockwork Orange was the British Intelligence Service's name given to a smear campaign intelligence operation that was used to really undermine and seek to bring down the British government of both Prime Minister Howard Wilson and also the Conservative Edward Heath.
Yes.
The ultimate beneficiary of whom actually was Mrs. Thatcher, because it propelled her to office. One of the things that I mentioned,
Clockwork Orange, Clockwork Orange was an umbrella title. People often think it's one operation. It wasn't. It was an umbrella title where different subjects came in according to priority. So this month it could be finance for the IRA from America. Next month it could be something else. But in 1974, it certainly was part of the campaign against the Wilson government, because he came to power really with power sharing. And because in 1972, he had advocated the solution to the Northern Ireland problem was United Ireland, that really frightened a lot of people in Whitehall. And so when he was elected in 74, promising to release detainees, then you can imagine that there were people in Whitehall who felt less than happy about him being Prime Minister.
Yes. Now, the question that I put this to Father McManus and to yourself, but Father Sean first, in that obviously he didn't know it at the time, but Father Sean, you met one of the abusers and agents in a context. John McCaig. Colin met another who subsequently was a Unionist MP, Enoch Powell. Father McManus, do either of the two of you, on reflection, feel that these people in particular were being protected and instructed by the state to fan the flames of sectarianism between Catholics?
Absolutely. I met with John McCaig, another prison paramilitary, in 1979 in a hotel in Belfast that was allegedly practically controlled by the loyalist paramilitaries, and I spent a couple of days in that hotel talking to these guys. We're trying to arrange an Irish conference in Washington that all the groups would come to. However, when I met McCaig, I had a distinct feeling that he had a huge sense of entitlement, that I also felt he was clearly a British agent, a police agent, a police informer, or whatever. And of course, as the time goes on, the reach of British intelligence in all sorts of corners in Ireland, north and south, has become more and more apparent. I'm glad what Colin said regarding the collusion thing. Of course, it goes to the very top. That's the very meaning of collusion. If it's not collusion, it's just a case of too bad apples. It goes to the very top of the British government. And that's why they're so determined that no information will be really given to the victims.
I think there's a corollary to that too. In 1990 plus, Sir John Stevens, who was the former Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, one of their top commissioners, he went to Northern Ireland to investigate collusion. And in addition to that, there were inquiries by Desmond de Silva QC and also by Judge Peter Kerr from Canada. Now, this is what Sir John Stevens told Parliament, and John Stevens is not a dangerous radical. This was his finding. He said, there was the RUC, MI5, and the Army all doing different things. When you talk about intelligence, of the 210 people we arrested, only 3 were not agents. Some of them were agents for all of those organizations, fighting against each other, doing things, making large sums of money, and all against the public interest and creating mayhem in Northern Ireland. That last sentence is powerful. All against the public interest and creating mayhem in Northern Ireland. This was the state actually doing that. That is the mad world that was Northern Ireland at that time.
One of the points, and I put this, I put it to you first, and then maybe Father McManus just wants to comment on it.
Donald, in 2 minutes, you need to make your concluding statement.
Okay, well, what I'll ask is that
There's no vote. No.
Would you essentially?
Donald, we cannot hear you.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
I'll just make this quick, this one, but lastly, do the two of you feel that following Brexit, the British government's proposed amnesty legislation for conflict-related offences will be used to try to deny Richard or Colin and also the victims, other victims, the full or partial redress? I mean, is that a possibility?
That's clearly the intention. That's the purpose.
You feel that it's an aim, yeah, of the legislation, yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, yes, no, I think it goes a stage further. You see, there is an inquiry going on by John Boucher at the moment. That inquiry is likely to be very embarrassing for the government because it's about collusion. And his officers, I've been interviewed by them, are doing a really good job. And I think this is aiming off for that bad news because they will draw a line under it. And any people he identified as being part of that collusion, I'd imagine it'll be a large number, will have a get out of jail free card. And I think that's fundamentally what it's about.
Okay, well, just in conclusion, I would thank you both for taking part in this. I'd like to pay tribute to both and the work that's being done in conjunction with Colin and also yourself, Father Sean and Barbara, as well as the other people on a wider scale who have been helping. This is an ongoing matter. I mean, for anyone watching, what we would state is that, you know, it doesn't rest with the court proceedings that are taking place by Richard or by Colin, and we have essentially involved the US authorities because whilst we need to let the court process take its time and see what results it produces, there is an attitude that essentially everyone involved, and particularly victims, have a wariness about whether the UK legal system can actually achieve full impartiality and redress as well as justice in these particular cases, but particularly that of Richard and yourself, Colin. So I thank you both, and indeed we'll continue the dialogue again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good
Thank
day.
you. You too.